Welcome everyone to our webinar today, Visibility for Security. You can't protect what you can't see. My name is Dana Leadholm and I am here on behalf of ID Agent. I'm the VP of Global Channel Programs and we are really excited today to have this presentation for you with Auvik, our great partner. And so I'm going to introduce to you today our two speakers. We have Patrick Albert, who is the Associate Vice President of Product Management for Auvik. Patrick is the Associate Vice President of Product Management and has been in the MSP space for many years. He has been in the field, so he's worked for an ISP and has an affinity for network management. He is passionate about technical support and apparently he really likes automation, according to his bio here. So we'll look forward to hearing a little bit more about his background and what he does there at Auvik. We also have a speaker today from ID Agent, our CEO. He is a co-founder of ID Agent. Kevin is a longtime entrepreneur in the technology space, both in the private and public sectors. And Kevin was headed up the team that provided identity restoration and ongoing protection for 4.2 million government employees after the biggest data breach in U.S. history for the Office of Personnel Management. And that was the spark that eventually brought about ID Agent. And he'll talk more about that. But I think these two guys probably want to just chit chat about something a little more personal. I'll hand it over to you guys, and then I think Patrick's going to kick it off, and then Kevin will take over.
Sounds good. Yeah, so just a little bit more about myself. I think your intro was fantastic. So I've been in the MSP space for well over 10 years now, both on the software side and on the actual MSP side. I'm Canadian, so I got to put that out there. You'll see a panda bear or a polar bear rather on our next slide. So definitely, the stereotypes apply. Absolutely love hockey and dealing with the cold weather right now.
Good. This is Kevin Lancaster with ID Agent. Most of our partners who I've met in person or have had some type of interaction with also know I'm a big hockey fan. I coach youth hockey in my spare time over at the Naval Academy in Annapolis. Unfortunately, I'm a diehard Washington Capitals fan, and that and about $2 gets you a cup of coffee these days. So I won't belabor all my sorrows of being a Caps fan. We'll kind of jump right into this, but I figured since we have great Canadian partners on, I'd throw that out there. So I'll let you jump right into it, Patrick.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right, so just for those of you that don't know what Auvik is or Auvik does, I'll just start out with a really quick introduction. So as we've already mentioned a couple times, very MSP focused. So what we are is a network management company, specifically around software built for MSPs. So we're 100% channel focused. We're headquartered in Waterloo, Canada, which is just about an hour outside of Toronto. Personally, myself, I'm based out of Ottawa, so a very Canadian company. We've got about 100 employees, a little over 1,000 MSP partners. And as I mentioned, I promised you a polar bear, and there he is. And his name's Nanook, so he's our mascot. So we'll be talking quite a bit about network management, which is kind of our bread and butter, and going into some of the details there. Absolutely. So I just wanted to start out with a really quick comment. So on the topic of visibility and understanding what's out there, I come from a very technical background. I started out as I mentioned earlier, as my career as being in tech support, working at an MSP doing tech support, ISP, and I know how much techs really despise the word framework, let alone anything that has to do with a framework. Typically, it's in my nature just go ahead and see a problem and fix a problem. But I wanted to talk a little bit about frameworks today, just as a bit of an introduction to this topic. And obviously the one that we've got up on the screen here is NIST cybersecurity framework. And the main point I want to drive here is really about it's understanding the full scope of the issue. So we'll be talking across various different scopes today. But each of these different phases is just as important as the other. So as we talk through visibility, and obviously you can't protect what you can't see. That's very, very much on the first end of the spectrum around identification. And it's often one of the most overlooked or underappreciated aspects of cybersecurity frameworks, and trying to protect your end customers. They're incredibly important, and they all, there's quite a few out there that have a fairly similar look and feel, but they all range from upfront identifying the devices, trying to put some measures in place, not just technology but process as well, to protect and then also detect and respond and ultimately recover. So I wanted to start out with that. It's an important kind of segue into, to provide a proper offering for your customer. You really need to look at all the different aspects and all the different parts of that entire framework. So, ultimately why we're all here is, having customers and ultimately trying to provide them with coverage. Right. So from their perspective, they've engaged you to provide support, and you're doing all the management of their devices. And when it comes down to it, it's up to you to provide as much coverage as possible in terms of preventing cybersecurity breaches. And if you look at a lot of the different ways that you can help on that front, there are a lot of insurance companies that are now starting to offer insurance for cybersecurity breaches. But ultimately, all of these different products that you can buy as in terms of coverage, all require that you do quote unquote best effort to protect your customers, again, and ultimately using industry best practices. Now, this is the fun part about the IT world we live in. Most of the time, and I used best practices in quotes, because most of the time, a lot of these things aren't necessarily defined, saying this is exactly what you need to do, just because every situation is a little bit different. But the guidelines are absolutely critically important to follow and understand. And it's ultimately on you to cover your clients and therefore yourself, right? So if they go down, if anything happens and you can't be proven that you've done your best effort to actually protect your customer and and actually looking to prevent and stop issues, that's where you can definitely get into some liability issues. So it's all about protecting your customer, but ultimately kind of behind the scenes also protecting yourself. So as we kind of continue past that theme, wanted to talk a little bit about the very, very beginning of that identification stage. Now, up on the screen here, we start out with a bit of a network assessment, but ultimately, the first step in most cybersecurity frameworks is identification. And I'll talk primarily around the networking and understanding kind of the physical devices and what's on the network. But it's important to note that while understanding the network topology and what physical devices are plugged in is really important, you also need to understand that that is a huge piece of the pie, but you also have to look at all the other aspects as well. And that's how it relates into, well, what SaaS applications are they using? What credentials are they using? And then what systems are they putting in place to prevent access restrictions and all of that. So my key point is, on the network topology side, understanding what is physically on the network is incredibly important. But it is part of a bigger picture, which we'll actually discuss a little bit later on the agent side as well, in terms of understanding from a user's perspective a little bit about breaches as well. So, one of the first things we recommend on the identification aspect, as I mentioned, is understanding everything that is plugged into and attached to their network. And as that relates to servers, endpoints, network devices, storage that's on there, hypervisors, but that was kind of the systems of, not necessarily yesterday, but those are kind of some of the more basic systems. We're also starting to see a lot more IoT and a lot of other types of devices entering these networks. So things like cameras or sensors. So understanding everything in that network is going to be key to understanding, what's your risk profile look like. So where did these devices come from? Are these from reputable vendors? And again, identifying what devices are out there and how they're all interconnected is a huge first step in understanding what's your attack surface look like and what do you actually need to protect yourself against. So specifically on the IoT topic, I think we can talk about this at length, but there's a lot of new challenges around cybersecurity that comes into play with IoT devices, around keeping them up to date, making sure that the data is secure. But again, the first step is really understanding what do you have out there, both from a physical perspective and then also users, permissions, SaaS applications, etc. So a lot of this is typical network assessment stuff, but it is absolutely critical to starting the journey of offering the right level of protection to customers. And from there, I've been on site, done a ton of these network assessments, and every single time you end up in a situation where you either open a closet and stuff falls out at you because there's so much stuff piled in the closet, or you look behind someone's desk and you see something like this. Lots of stuff, lots of things plugged in all over the place, and your first thought is, this is terrible, I gotta run away. And this is dangerous, but ultimately it's the bigger part of your job is not necessarily just identifying what's out there, it's uncovering the why is it like this in the first place. So before you can really come up with a solution or an answer, if you deem this dangerous, it's definitely important to understand, how did it get here? Was this just a series of unfortunate events and they needed to keep stacking switches or stacking stuff onto power cables and all this stuff together? Was it just a series of unfortunate events, or is this by design? So as we added new systems, how did that get integrated into their workflow and into their office, or is it all just daisy chained together? We've all seen 5 or 6 power bars plugged into each other, and sometimes that just happens because that's just how it got there. But ultimately, it's understanding the why. Why is it like this? So we've seen some customers go on site, do a network assessment, and see an FTP server running on a particular server. And at first glance, it's like, wow, this is really out of place. Maybe this is malicious, or maybe this is bad. But ultimately, it was there in place for what seemed to be a good thing to do a couple of years ago. They were doing backups of a couple of things, and that's just the best way they were to store it. So that was less of a series of unfortunate events that led them there, and it was just as they grew and expanded, so did their infrastructure, and so did all the pieces and attachments that came to it. But no one took the time to kind of reassess on a regular basis. Well, why is this here? Is this still needed? And is there a better way at solving this problem? But again, you can't really understand that until you've uncovered the why behind why the situation's like that in the first place. And that relates to, obviously, first on the cabling front, as I mentioned, opening up closets has been a terrifying experience from my perspective. Opening up, and there's often lots of things that are all connected into each other. Sometimes falling out of the closets, keep it closed just to prevent all the cables from sticking out. But again, you got to respect the fact that it got there for a reason, but understanding that why is key, and that leads itself into understanding that why is part of the visibility, or the first stage, because again, it's inventorying what they have, but also what problems they have. So they may have employed a lot of different solutions to solve a particular problem that they had a couple of years ago, and maybe that problem doesn't exist anymore. So that's why you can once you start understanding the why and how their business has evolved, and how their network and everything together has all evolved. That's where you can start taking a look and actually identifying these things, and calling them out on a topology or even a list, just saying, we're seeing these servers that just are still plugged in, running a really old version of Windows here. They don't look like they're being accessed, and the answer may very well just be, oh yeah, we used to use an application that did stuff, and I guess we just never turned it off. Well, that's a huge attack vector that someone can take advantage of. And again, if that's there for a good reason, then you got to put the right systems in place to protect it, which is, again, the next stage of the cybersecurity framework. But understanding that why is really important. That it really helps drive the solution behind what you're doing there. And again, just to reiterate some of those things, from a technical perspective, the technical aspect of doing an assessment with the right tools is very, very easy. Going in, discovering all the different devices on the network, classifying them, You can argue with the right tool set. That's a very easy thing to do. But where your value really comes in is pairing that with the business aspect and challenging kind of the status quo to understand what's out there. So it's less about just doing a network assessment, but also kind of just challenging and understanding the environment is absolutely key there. And as we start talking about understanding what's out there, just as important to that is understanding when things change. So, obviously when you have a network assessment that's done, so maybe you did that when you first took on a customer, and you understand that layer, how everything's all plugged in, and you understand all the different devices and why they're there. Um, Things aren't going to be static. Things are going to change very, very frequently, especially with the consumerization of IT, where the people dealing with technology there are fairly well versed in it and aren't scared of just buying something at a local Best Buy and plugging it into the network. We've seen way too many cases where that the end customer just didn't want to quote unquote bother the MSP with doing something simple, so they actually just go to Best Buy or eBay and buy the cheapest thing they can find to solve their problem and just plug it into the network. And again, maybe there's a really good reason to why that happened. But understanding that has happened is absolutely critical, and being able to react quickly is just as important. So if they go out and buy something that maybe they shouldn't have and they plugged in into the network, if it takes another quarter or potentially until you do the next network assessment, that being on the network for that long may actually expose that customer to quite a few threats, depending on what that is and how it's configured. Because a lot of these devices that they'll just plug in will often just have default credentials or no security. So understanding that has been added to the network is really important, and it's very, very time sensitive that you know that as quick as possible. And again, that doesn't necessarily just relate to devices and the network. It also relates to other applications that have been added to the network. Or even custom configuration changes that have been made. So again, it's really having a solid relationship to drive this home and understand what's on the network and what's actually happening from a business perspective. Helps drive that visibility. Is going back to the original point of this discussion topic here was, if you don't know what's out there, you can't protect them. And that relates to both protecting them from it and from others as well. On the topic of IoT, I've mentioned it a couple times, but we've definitely had a couple customers where someone has gone online to order the cheapest door sensor from eBay that they could possibly find. And we took a couple examples of that, and I looked into the hardware that they purchased, and it had zero security. It was attached to the Wi-Fi because it was easy for the end customer to actually plug in and pair it with the Wi-Fi. And there was no security. Everything was completely open, and it was also a fairly it wasn't a reputable vendor, so we don't even know what the software is doing, let alone whether it allows access to the network or listens to other things and relays the information back. So lots of opportunities for threats nowadays, and being able to react quickly is critical to being able to understand and protect your customers. So, and the last component of understanding what's out there is details are pretty critical. So understanding, having kind of a sketch of what's out there is good, obviously, and it's better than nothing, but having a very, very detailed outlook is really critical to recovery. And I look at this from a couple different perspectives, one of them being on the configuration front. So us being in the fairly network world, we see a lot of configurations changes made to network equipment, so like switches, routers, access points, etc. And if you don't have all the information as to what that configuration looked like, if there's ever any issue where you actually have to restore that configuration, so whether that is a like environmental problem or a failure of the device, knowing everything about that network is key. Otherwise, if you have to rebuild the configuration manually, you're likely putting yourself in a situation where you're potentially going to miss something or misconfigure something, which could ultimately turn into a lot of tech support time when the customer's complaining that something's no longer working the way that it used to, just because you forgot about a particular firewall rule because you didn't know about it in the first place. So very, very critical in terms of understanding the details, both of the topology, what's plugged into what, so you can quickly recover from that. But that also relates into backups of configuration across all devices, whether that's network equipment or otherwise. Very, very critical to being able to actually restore quickly. So details are critical to the success of this understanding. So ultimately, that at a high level, those were some of the components I wanted to talk to on the network front. As I mentioned earlier, Auvik is a network management solution specifically for MSPs. Our claim to fame is what you see on the screen here, which is our automated real-time network inventory, where it's able to go out and discover networks and quickly and in real time draw the topology, whether that is network equipment or otherwise. And that's PCs, phones, cameras, anything that's plugged into the network will understand where it is and why. And as I mentioned earlier, with the right tools, doing network assessments is the technical aspects of it is fairly straightforward. A situation like this, and then if you pair that with your business context and your business knowledge, that's where you can really start driving home the value of network assessments. So with that, I'll go ahead and pass it off to you.
Great. I guess I'll get control here. Some of your comments here made me think about some of the rogue apps that we're starting to see, and it's kind of akin to back in the day where you'd have people doing drive-by Wi-Fi hopping, right? They just go find open Wi-Fi and hop on, see what they can do within proximity of a business or retailer or what have you. But we're seeing out in tour in certain areas, seeing this kind of emergence of ping IP, so ping IP. So you can use mobile apps, you can use something like a Shodan and ping certain IP ranges, ping ports, figure out which organizations are running default passwords on consumer products. I mean, everything from cameras to doorbells to I think on Shodan even they flash the networked refrigerators. And so you're absolutely spot on with just the volume of IoT and consumer products coming out that are supposed to make our lives easier. It's making networks that much more challenging. So I'm sure you guys are seeing something similar, but it's kind of the new era, new world we live in these days. All right, so Chelsea, do I have control here? I do. Good, great. So as we kicked off, this is Kevin Lancaster with ID Agent, and I'll follow up on some of the things that Patrick touched on. But maybe the best way to look at our two organizations, at high level, is that they're concerned about what's on network, what's touching networks, what you have, what you don't know you have, and we're concerned with essentially data that's off the network, data that we can find. Data that can be used to exploit your customer, whether it be within the network or maybe even on a third-party application that is business approved, but is mission critical and it can be used to exploit an organization. So kind of getting a real quick history, just 2 seconds, 2 minutes or less, but let's see here. So 2012 to 2016, we were firmly entrenched in enterprise public sector, supporting federal agencies, U.S. federal agencies, DoD, Intel, and the like. As mentioned, Dana mentioned earlier, in May of 15, coming up on 3 years ago, we were tasked by the Office of Personnel Management to come in and provide remediation, identity remediation to 4.2 million government employees. And prior to that, we'd been working on these dark web capabilities for about 3 or 4 years. We just actually had commercialized it, but that was really a catalyst for us to come out and really focus on bringing these capabilities to just the broader public or private sector industry. Up until about 10 months ago, we were almost exclusively enterprise focused. So our customers are the largest, law firms, largest financial firms, largest sports leagues. Run this for entire states, for governments, both foreign and domestic. But back in May, we had an article written on us, and we pivoted, and we are now exclusively channel focused on supporting our MSPs and really getting down to the broader population. We're having such a force multiplier impact and impact on individuals that it's just it's a market that we're just not going to shy away from, and we've kind of pivoted 100%. And in that time frame, obviously, we've established ourselves as the leader in this space, hands down. And so, let's see here. I've got flip our slide. So you think about these Amazon. Think about Amazon.com for a moment, and the ease or the ability to buy data on an Amazon or a product, anything on Amazon.com. A lot of the areas that we're looking for compromised data are call them rogue or maliciously minded Amazon.coms, where individuals are buying and trading data, buying and trading personal email addresses, social security numbers, dates of birth, mother's maiden names. They're really having a field day with exploited data. And the real big challenge is that most of our enterprise customers understand that this stuff goes on, and they are investing and really, taking this serious. But the customers that the MSPs that we work with, the customers that they represent, have a hard time understanding that this world exists. And we've kind of come up with this concept of the cyber poverty line. Most of your customers, most of the MSP's customers, fall below this cyber poverty line. They may have heard a LifeLock commercial. They may have heard an Experian commercial. They may know about Target and Home Depot and all this commercialized stuff, or Equifax, but they really don't understand how just devastating these things can be. They're somewhat blind to the complexity of these cyber threats. Most of them do have won't happen to me attitude until something does, and then we often get a call in breach response, breach remediation. And they end up being very costly and negative experiences for those individuals. And what we've seen over the last 10 months is that a lot of the customers that the MSPs are working with are complacent. They can't conceptualize or understand why they need SIM, firewall, network monitoring, endpoint, two-factor. Why do they need all these things to be safe going forward? And what's been really great about the last 10 months is that we're having that much of an impact in helping our MSPs really understand, or helping our MSPs convey that message to their customers. The data that we show, the data that we provide, is very visceral. It's very emotional. It's very raw. It's someone's email address and password. It's the password. If you think about it, it's near and dear to the individual. And when you show a business owner, CEO, VP, CTO, whomever, that their email address and passwords exposed, and it's out there in clear text for just about anybody to, do bad things with, it does become a very raw and emotional kind of a response. And so the data, as I mentioned, where a lot of the focus of the data is really on the email address and password, because your customers are making it harder for you to protect them, right? It is a fact that nearly 80% of people will use the same or a derivation of the same password across everything they log into. Maybe they have one or two passwords, but and they'll play the password game. They'll play, if it's Johnny1 today, it's Johnny123 or Johnny1 with an exclamation point tomorrow, and it gets recycled across everything they log into on and off network. And we've had the pleasure to sit across from the most sophisticated CISOs globally, running global 50, and probably 50%, 60% of those conversations and meetings we've had that particular individual's email address and password. And these are conceivably the most sophisticated in the cybersecurity space, but they're all guilty of it as well. And so this is really where we focused here the last year in supporting the channel, helping them show their customers just how exposed they are and how much harder it's making the job of the MSP to protect themselves. I know, Patrick, you mentioned something early on where there's this concept of best effort. in supporting your customer. In our opinion, best effort now is looking beyond the network. You have to look outside the network to see what data is out there that can be used to exploit the network, and can be used to exploit, maybe the company's LinkedIn, page. Maybe they're using Salesforce.com, and you think about the data that an organization would have on their customers inside of a Salesforce.com or HubSpot or something like that. You think about accessing web-based, 365, right? That's a huge vulnerability these days with organizations and MSPs, because it's not necessarily something it's not on network, it's not tied into monitoring. It's something that's web-based, it's easily accessible. Most organizations, balk at the idea of putting, simple two-factor on, logging into 365, right? So when we show these email addresses and passwords, and we have these types of conversations, it really starts to, make the point that they need to be thinking about this. This is a little screenshot. I mean, of some of the compromised credentials that we might find out there. There's also this idea now that there's particularly here in the States, there are public sites like a True People Search or a Spokio or Intellius, or name one of maybe hundreds now that aggregate big data, public data that's coming from mortgage information and all over the place, tying in your social media profiles. You start to look at that kind of data that's coming out of the True People Search type websites. Combine that with email addresses and passwords, and you can see how easy it is to exploit an individual and then jump on network and exploit the network with the right access. And so, a lot of this stuff that we talk about to our partners and to their customers, maybe a couple of years ago, people thought it was all smoke and mirrors, but we could show you, probably hundreds of incidences just in the last, 2 months, 3 months, where this stuff happens, and the effects of these, incidents are devastating to the organizations and the individuals. So again, we show this data because if we have this data, that means the bad guys have this data as well. So let me hop to the next one. So if we're looking in Tor, we're looking in Ukrainian, Russian, forums. We're looking at different sites that might be buying and trading, exploiting Social Security numbers, what have you. That means we're in there. Certainly law enforcement is there, is just trying to get in there and help monitor. But the folks that have bad intentions or maliciously motivated have this data as well. I mean, you hear about nation states. Obviously, there's organized crime, Eastern Europe, Russia. I mean, it's organized crime is an understatement. Those are multi-billion-dollar industries. You've got your hacktivists, you got your malicious insiders, you've got folks, and we see this quite often. Actually, we saw this right after the OPM breach, right after Wolf Blitzer came on CNN and said OPM had suffered a massive data breach. And next morning we had an individual in the Ukraine that said, no, it wasn't it wasn't a nation state, it wasn't China, it was me. This individual basically repurposed old data that was out there from the first LinkedIn breach or set of data that was exposed, resorted it, tried to pass it off as all.mil.gov. Turns out that that individual was, auditioning for a spot in the Russian intelligence services. So we see this stuff, day in and day out. If we have it, then others have it, and we really want to bring it to your attention and to your customers' attention. So I've got a couple more slides here, not too many. As mentioned, Dana mentioned, right, with this OPM program that we had monitored or managed. At that point, we had, millions of people enrolled, and we could definitively say, because we knew that they are current and former government employees, we can tie them back to their .mil.gov and their social security numbers. We could say that 73% of that population had a compromised email address and password. And further, 33% of those email addresses and password, the email addresses ended in a .mil or .gov. And so, if you think about vulnerability, you think about vulnerability at that scale. You've got millions of government employees. You've got millions of potential entry points into government networks, and you play that password reusage game. Those networks were wide open. You overlay that with the general U.S. population, those numbers become staggering. And this number is a little dated because it's from 2015, but we'll probably top out at about 83% of the population, 84% of the population we have some type of data on. So it's not a couple years ago where you had a couple breaches, you hear about them, there might be some type of data. The data out there is voluminous, and it's growing, and it's often overstated, but it's not if, it's when, and most of us have had some type of exposure or incident, but don't know it. And so this is often a really interesting precursor in showing individuals, and they start going out and looking at their logs. They start looking personally at their credit reports, and we get some pretty interesting cases that we start working on the credit monitoring side as well. Another topic for another time. But drop in here. I mentioned a little bit of this. These are some of those sites that have been verified, or True People Search. After this call, you might want to do yourselves a favor, everybody listening in. You go out to one of these sites and put your name, your first name, last name, and city or state into these sites. You'll be blown away by, again, how much big data is out there on individuals, your known associates, your previous addresses, your relatives. And you click on one of your relatives' names or your known associates' names, and you can play that 6 degrees of separation, the Kevin Bacon game, pretty easily with these sites. And so a lot of this is just a lot of it's education, letting individuals really know how bad it is out there. But again, you tie this surface web data that's out there with somebody's credential, you can exploit an individual in a network in a matter of moments. Let's see here. A couple more slides. There's another kind of visual of some of the data that we'll show within our platform. We'll show the email address, the password hit, the source type. And if we are confident about disclosing the source, then we'll put it in there. You'll see down below some of these fields say not disclosed. Our stance is that we're not going to go out there and throw an organization under the bus until they've had a chance to publicly declare or announce that they've had some type of incident. You'll see some of these free pwn sites that have a lot of fictitious or false data that's not really validated. We'll validate data. We'll give the organization a chance to publicly announce them. When they do, we'll go back and add that attribution back into our platform. So another level of protection for our partners when dealing with this type of data. So with that, I think I'm at the end of my slides. I think we've got a couple offers for partners and folks on the line here. We've got a couple different levels that we levels of service that we provide. $300, $400 level. We include 50 additional live search for the first 3 months. On our prospecting tool, the 500 level, we include 5 additional domains. And so with it, MSPs use our tool is they have the ability to go in and run a scan of essentially any domain that they want to run. They'll get the results. The passwords will be partially masked because we're assuming at that point they may not be a customer, that you haven't had that conversation with them. And then the other side of the platform, we allow you to monitor proactively, continuously for your customers' compromised data. We've got some really interesting, really exciting announcements here in the next couple of weeks about some major integration pushes, some additional capabilities, enhancements to the platform, and really excited about the next at least 10 months here with our partners and obviously beyond. We're going to grow quickly and put a lot of resources into helping partners be successful in this space. So with that, I think I'm at the end of my slides.
Good, that's awesome, perfect timing. So we've been having a lot of questions come in, you guys, that was great. And there's a slide up there that gives you an offer from Auvik. So Patrick, I sent you a question that you can go ahead and answer, and then I'll also read you a couple more questions after you answer that one that we've gotten.
Sure, just take a look at some of the different questions. Was it the one around generating alerts?
Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah, so there's a couple questions around alert generation. What can Auvik do, and kind of where can that information ultimately end up going? From a monitoring perspective, Auvik goes in and discovers a lot of information about network devices, And that varies from performance information to actually looking at like spanning tree changes or some fairly detailed alerting. So right now our integrations outward can either go into Autotask ConnectWise, email, and you can also have kind of webhooks directly into the product as well, so we can push information out to potentially different APIs. So then the question was specifically around some SIEM providers. So I think the easiest answer there is probably email, but we can definitely take a look offline and deal with any specific ones if you wanted to talk about any specific SIEM providers or solutions.
Perfect. Okay. Another question here. How often should you refresh your network assessment?
So I think that's a good question. So it was something I talked about a little bit earlier around doing the network assessment. A lot of MSPs will go on site and do once per quarter, once per year, or kind of at a fairly regular scheduled interval. So we talked about how Auvik can do real-time discovery of that. So I think obviously having a solution that can real-time discover that type of information is awesome. But spending time on site which is actually another question I saw in here, spending time on site is just as valuable when it comes to network assessments as well. Is from our perspective, we can pull in and see all the different devices that are physically attached to a network. Again, that's IP cameras to pretty much anything that has an IP. But again, you don't necessarily get to see everything that isn't connected to the network, right? So there are a lot of other potential attack vectors in terms of, not necessarily just cell phones, but other devices that don't necessarily attach to the network that could actually provide other attack vectors. So I definitely recommend spending some time on site. A lot of people like doing this as part of their QBR, kind of just doing a walkthrough and taking a look and seeing if anything else has changed. But yeah, it's a combination of kind of a real-time view and then actually interacting with the customers and discovering what other devices or problems they may have on site as well.
That's great. Thank you. So Kevin, this question is for you. Why does the password field show clear text passwords sometimes and encrypted passwords other times?
Good question. Often, so when we see these compromises, I guess short answer is, not every compromise is alike. We will at times get full clear text passwords. We'll get encryption keys. There are dictionaries out there that you can, run hashes against, and you'll see the clear text password. So when we see an exploit, we see a data set, we'll pull it in regardless if it's been hashed or if the password's in clear text. We're going back behind the scenes and brute forcing and working with some technologies to crack these passwords. But our stance is whether it's encrypted or not, or hashed or not, we should be putting it in the platform. You also see within the platform another column that shows additional PII hits. So often it's the case where we might have the email address in clear text. We may not have the exact password, but we might also have social security number, date of birth, mother's maiden name, social security number, credit card information, what have you. So it's at that point, it's really about the urgency of the data and getting it validated and putting it in the platform, as opposed to at times waiting several months in some cases to brute force some of these passwords. So we do work with some consortiums and with law enforcement on these passwords and indexing. So just like with attribution, we'll go back in as we can. We'll add in the password in clear text to show that this is a valid password.
Cool. All right. Great. Thank you. Patrick, we have a question for you. How does IoT fit into what Auvik does? Hello?
I think it's probably impacting them significantly.
What's that?
Significantly is a good answer. Yeah, so to be honest, that's probably a topic that we can probably do an entire webinar on. But I think the punchline is significantly. Devices, as I mentioned earlier, are jumping on networks. People are bringing their own devices. whether that is malicious or not, typically on the not side. So that's where a lot of different things like Rogue IT can apply, but they expose a lot of interesting new challenges. One of the challenges I'd argue is around passwords, as we've already talked a little bit about. We do see it often enough that network devices actually run on default passwords. That's fairly frequent. But IoT devices is probably almost 100% of the time, or very, very frequent. So that plays into our picture quite a bit. From our perspective, we love when people are using default passwords because we can do an even better job of discovering what's out there and showing you the information. So we can have an even better map with default stuff, but largely it's a bigger concern. So when we go in and do network discoveries and trying to draw our map, the more information we can get, the better the map looks and the more accurate that information is. But with the more locked down the network is, the more you have to kind of input into our product in terms of passwords. But IoT definitely falls into that category where most of them are using default passwords.
Yeah, great. Okay, and where can an MSP find pricing for Auvik's offering?
So on the last slide there, we talked about an offer that we had. So if you just go to the URL specified, that I know the presentation will also be sent out. The first step is probably booking a demo and kind of taking a look at how this best applies to your situation. Our pricing is done per network device. So again, we'll discover all these different types of devices, bring a ton of information about them, but we'll only charge you for certain types of devices, things like switches, routers, firewalls. So the pricing is only specifically to those devices, and we have quite a few different packages that we can apply depending on how big your environment is and how many customers you'd be applying it to. So I definitely suggest taking a look and signing up. Go to the website in the presentation, and then you also get a $5 Starbucks gift card for just signing up for a demo as well.
That's great. And Kevin, the same question came for you to explain how the ID dark web ID pricing works.
Yeah, I think the best way to do that is, hop on our homepage and submit a contact form. We can kind of walk you through it. But basically, we have 3 or 4 very simplistic tiers. $300 level up per month, 400, 500. There's a 750. Actually, I think there's a 900 level as well. But most start out around the $400 level, and they get some certain amount of domains that they can monitor per month, and then a number of searches they can run within the platform. So we keep it very, very simplistic, with our pricing. So,
yeah.
So there.
Kevin, can you talk a little bit about what kind of support your team offers after the MSP signs up?
Yeah, I know.
Or would you like me
to? You can. I'll touch on it real quick because I can give you guys some kudos there. No, so we've got a phenomenal partner team that their job is to essentially be a part of our partners team. So they're creating slicks, materials, co-branded videos that we've put together that help the MSPs get the message out to their customers. Do a lot of training. We have templates on how to price, templates on conversations, email campaigns. You're seeing that it is a marketplace where it's again, the data is somewhat shock and awe, and you got to be very careful about how you show the data. But we've got I think some best practices that really have helped MSPs just knock the MRR out of the park. I also mentioned that some are selling this as a standalone monitoring service at call it $99 a month, or up to even $500 a month. I'm seeing on kind of the smaller end of the spectrum. Some are bundling it in with their MSSP offering, the MSSP offering. As a couple dollars or $1 per seat per month or 50 cents. I mean, it really depends on the scale. But our team's there to really help with that sales process. And this is a tool, as I mentioned earlier, that is just having such a tremendous impact on our partners' ability to initially, get that first meeting with new prospects, but then it's also allowing them to sell the other tools that they've been trying to sell, because they can walk in and say, see, this is why you need all these things that we're doing. This is why you need Auvik. This is why you need all these security tools, because the data's out there and it's going to be used against you. So sorry, I got on a No, I'm not tangent there.
I might have actually teed that one up. Patrick, I've got a question here. I can't afford to be spending time doing assessments for free. Do I charge for it?
Awesome question. Yeah, it's a question I think we get fairly frequently from our customers and our partners, trying to, how do we actually monetize this, or do you monetize this? I'd say a good amount of partners are trying to, again, I think we started out this webinar talking about my love of automation. A lot of customers and partners are going down the route of trying to automate as much as possible. Network assessments are expensive, and I think the first front is you can try to avoid that cost and reduce that cost as much as possible. Spending a couple of days doing it is definitely huge expense to yourself. And while you can probably get away with charging for network assessments, and quite a few of our MSPs do, it's not enough to cover the cost of having someone on site for a couple of days. So I think the automation is, the first point is key to success, and that's using Auvik, but that's using various other tools to understand, what's on there, and permissions and endpoint assessment solutions. But yeah, I'd say definitely in terms of being able to charge your customer for it. But it's all about trying to reduce your costs, because you can never pass on a couple of full days of labor for a network assessment, at least in smaller organizations. And just a note to Kevin here, I just checked my ID on been verified, but the state only has a state drop-down menu, so nothing for Canadians. That means my identity is safe, right?
I'm sure there are plenty of .cas out there that we can have fun with. Yeah, we'll have a beer one night and we'll play how much information can we find out about you. No, I'm kidding. No, I'm not.
Watch the Ottawa Senators win, probably.
Oh,
that was last year. Sorry, not this year.
Oh, you had to go there. You had to go there. Last place, right? No.
Hey, last year we did pretty good.
Yeah, that was last year.
Sorry to hijack your questions.
I can't talk smack, because again, every year, we have the Capitals do a great job of getting to the playoffs and then stab me in the heart. So I'm not good for smack talking here when it comes to hockey.
All right, you two, back to business. So I think we're going to go ahead and wrap a few minutes early, but I would just ask Patrick, if there is one little snippet of information that you could leave our listeners with. And I am going to provide, just so everyone here knows, I will be providing the full presentation and contact information, plus the answers to all the questions that came in today. But if there's one sort of overarching message you could leave our group here with, what would it be?
I'd have to, two came to mind, but the first one is kind of the thing I really harped on the most, is understand the why before offering any solutions. Is definitely the overarching theme I'd definitely suggest. It's jumping to a conclusion, or trying to offer a solution without fully understanding the problem either leads to the wrong solution or kind of the wrong business impact. So take all the technology and all the information you can get from all these great tools out there and pair that with a conversation, and that'll lead to the right solution.
Right, that's great stuff. Kevin, same question for you. What would be the one thing you'd want people to remember if they leave this?
Just one, huh? No, I think the one thing that they have to remember or think about is that they have to start looking for this data. They have to start looking at this data. They have to start getting comfortable with showing this data to their customer. And it's not an indictment on your abilities as an MSP. More of it's a, hey, Mr. Customer, your people aren't doing us any favors in trying to protect you. I think that's one of the things that early on, I think a lot of the partners that we had really couldn't get that message across. Just didn't come across properly. But now, I mean, it has to be looked for, this kind of data, because of the volume of compromises that our credential base are so overwhelming these days. You can't be afraid to show this data to your customer and say, look, you're not helping us. We have to add this in as part of our cybersecurity best practices. It does meet or fit into, whether it's NIST 800-171 or 53, or if you look at GDPR, even some of the requirements in GDPR, it's fitting squarely within these frameworks. And so there's probably like 2 or 3 things, but I think the short answer again is that your customers, you need to know, your customers need to know, because again, if we have this data, there are plenty of bad folks out there that have this data that are going to use it a lot differently than we would, trying to help solve these problems. So I am getting long-winded today. I apologize. So, that's it.
Thank you so much. You guys, this was great. I've gotten some really nice feedback from some of our listeners, and we just want to thank all of you for taking time out of your day to hear what we have to say. It's both our company's mission to help secure your customers, and so that's why we're doing this. We want to educate you and offer you the best products that we can. So we really appreciate you taking time out of your day today. And again, I'll send this proactively a link to everybody who attended so that they can download the presentation. And we hope to speak to you all or see you at an event here in the near future. Thank you.